We are live.
All right. Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this last leg of the undergraduate dissertation research symposium at SEA at the School of Environment and Architecture. And we've seen some very rich discussions over the last 3.5 days, and we're finally sort of at the second last panel. And let me sort of start by introducing the discussants. Our panel is called Pandemic Spatialities, and the three discussants we have here today are Vishwanath Kashikar, who's of course Associate Professor at the Faculty of Architecture at CEPT. We have with us Kush Patel, who's Associate Professor of Architecture and Humanities at Avni Institute of Design. And we also have with us Prasad Khanolkar, the Assistant Professor of Geography at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Guwahati. So welcome discussants to this panel. We have three panelists who will be presenting their works, their research works on this panel of pandemic spatialities. We have Krutika Dhelia, who will be going first, and the title is Post-Pandemic Spatiality, where she tries to understand the spatial changes that occur as a result of health pandemic across various scales, at the scale of the household, the neighborhood, as well as the city. And what she does is identifies contemporary practices that have emerged during the current pandemic situation. The second presentation that we have today is by Priyanka Neve, whose title is Shaping Publicness, Recreational Grounds in Mumbai's Suburban Settings. And her study is based in IC Colony. And what she does is she looks at the recreation areas, the gardens, park, all kinds of public spaces, to understand how communities use these spaces, what is the social and behavioral aspects, and what is the value addition, and specifically with the lens of the pandemic. The third presentation is by Tarishi Sehgal, which the title of which is Environment Recast, a glossary of device partialities in a pandemic. Her questions are rooted in understanding the relationship between space and activities with the lens of transgression, and especially at the time of this pandemic, how are these spaces being reimagined with varying transgressions, practices which are amplifying during the pandemic, and basically observing the revised partiality of the city, specifically in the neighborhood of Borivali West. Of course, to introduce the panel itself, it is something that we've sort of lived through and discussed over and over again for the last many months. With that, I sort of invite Kritika to begin her presentation, followed by Priyanka and Tarishi.
Thank you, Komal. I'll just present my screen. Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay. So, hi, I'm Krutika, and my thesis is titled Post-Pandemic Spatiality. So, the thesis aims to develop spatialities responsive to a condition of pandemic for the smooth functioning of socio-economic lives. The objectives are to identify practices that emerge during the pandemic, to observe the change in
All the best.
Thank you.
to observe the change in behavior patterns of people and record the panic responses, to establish a relationship between the emerging practices and space. The research question then becomes, how does a health pandemic change the imagination of space? For the research methodology, I'm following two parts. So in the first part, I'm studying the spatial implication of previous pandemics at multiple scales. And in the second part, I'm archiving the emerging practices in the form of a COVID glossary. So this table shows 4 major pandemics which have occurred in the past: cholera, tuberculosis, Bombay plague, and Spanish flu, and their impact at various scales: the household, the building, the neighborhood, and the city. So the cholera was widely affected New York City, wherein the changes at the household level were indoor plumbing and toilets inside the house. At the building level, there were septic tanks and foundations inside the building to hold wastewater. There were drinking water foundations, wide boulevards, and wastewater plants at the neighborhood level. And at the city level, the first aqueduct was built, which was the Croton Aqueduct. The idea of the Central Park first came into existence. There were straight roads and separate cholera cemeteries. In tuberculosis, the household level changes were sleeping porches, white interiors, and powder rooms. At the building level, there were balconies and terraces extensively used. Neighborhood level, there were wide verandas and cottages, and at the city level, the idea of the garden city first came into existence. The Bombay plague, at the household level, there were bylaws which said that sunlight angle should be 63 degrees inside the houses, and they removed extra tenants from the house. And at the building level, there were additional stories to accommodate the people that were displaced. There was slum clearance at the neighborhood level. The idea of the apartment first came up, and there were too many open spaces which were segregated according to the bylaws. And at the city level, there was sanitary housing, and new roads were built to connect the north and south of the city. The Spanish flu at the household level, there were planned spaces, French windows. At the building level, minimalism and Corbusier's 5 points of architecture came into existence. At the neighborhood level, there were proper waste management and increase in the number of playgrounds. And at the city level, there was single-use zoning and urban planning. So coming to the current pandemic, I have archived all the practices that I came across. So balcony spaces have now become the new spot for activities which earlier fell under the outdoor section. On 22nd March, these structures gained socio-political significance nationally when PM Modi urged every citizen to applaud the healthcare workers by clapping and clanging utensils. In a pre-lockdown scenario, people had the liberty to enter shops and look and touch various products, compare prices, find new items, etc. But in the current scenario, there are bamboo barricades outside most shops which omit all these possibilities and change the experience of shopping. There is a change in commodities sold by shop owners. Ashok Gupta, whose shop attracted a large number of foodies relishing on the varieties of momos sold by him, became jobless during the lockdown as only essential item shops were allowed to function and people were avoiding street food. He still had to pay the rent of the shop, so he resorted to selling all sorts of sanitization products and masks. Known for hosting some of the largest city exhibitions in the city, NMC Ground and Exhibition Center in Goregaon has become a major COVID-19 treatment center in the suburbs. The transformation of halls to a COVID health center with nursing stations, contactless booths for doctors, oxygen pipelines, and areas for donning and doffing of PPEs took a few weeks. So the idea of festivals has also changed during the pandemic, and so the NMC Ground, which was earlier a major venue for Navratri activities, has now become a COVID center, but still there were healthcare workers who played Garba and Dandiya inside the COVID center so that the patients don't experience FOMO. And Ganesh Utsav was a low-key affair in the city of Mumbai for the first time. People made idols themselves and immersed them inside the house. So the home has become a safety bubble. As lockdown becomes the new normal, it has forced us to engage with spaces that the house offers in different ways. The home is now the office, the gym, the classroom, the salon, the movie theater, and much more. So the Drolia couple who stay in their 1 BHK flat in Malad got their lives strictly restricted to their home when Mrs. Drolia tested positive for COVID, with mild symptoms though. Their doctor advised her home quarantine in the presence of only one bathroom in the house, which had to be used by the patient. Mr. Drolia converted the kitchen into his bathing space. Going to the market meant coming in direct contact with people from all over. Hence, this system of fruits and vegetable trucks was started, which delivered across various apartment complexes. Microphobia, or the fear of contamination. This has been observed in the members of the Sharma family who wash each and every note that is withdrawn from the bank and dry it on the dining table for 14 hours. so that all traces of the virus, if any, are gone. Extensive washing of all commodities that enter the house is mandatory. The commodities go through 3 buckets. The first one containing potassium permanganate, the second one containing soap water, and finally clean drinking water. Sometimes washing machines are also used for the purpose. Uh, Eating a happy meal on Sunday was a ritual for the Kapoor family, as their son loved collecting the free toys that came along. They would sit inside the restaurant and have their Sunday supper. But after the lockdown, when restaurants were allowed to function again, McDonald's came up with this takeaway counter outside the store. And the restaurants which have recently opened up now offer no-touch digital menus that are accessible after the through the QR code on the phone. So this drawing shows the various panic responses recorded inside the supermarket. Right at the entry, the lady is seen checking the Arogya Setu app and check how many cases are nearby and how much cautious she should be. And there were also various fake news and rumors that every 15 days that कल से military वाले आएंगे, महीने भर का सामान ले लेता हूँ. And hoarding practices were also observed. So most of the supermarkets were out of Dettol and people wanted it in extensive quantities. And there were also black market activities and adulteration and all of that. Rickshaw drivers installed safety partitions just behind the driver's seat in their autos for restricting contact and to facilitate social distancing. The elliptical machines at Five Fitness Gym also used clear dividers. So the idea of the open space changed when this is an area in Sundarnagar, which was earlier used for grazing, cattle grazing. But after the 2-kilometer rule, all the confiscated vehicles were kept here in this open space. So this is outside Millaps in the Mazin Kandivli. Earlier, these staircases were only used for going up and down, but now all the walkers, passers-by and joggers, they use this area as a shaded resting space. So this slide shows the various tactics of spreading awareness about the virus, which is adapted by policemen. Religion forms the foundation of lives in India. Worship in the pre-COVID time was done by touching feet of the idol, offering fruits, vegetables, sweets to it. But right now, outside the Man Mandir temple, people are seen with symbols and they still remove their chappals and worship the Lord through this collapsible gate. So coming to the conclusion, this drawing shows all the practices that I have observed, and the conclusions then become de-densification of public spaces. There's an annexure to places like shops, temples, grocery stores, and clinics. There's multiple uses of a single space which had a specific utility earlier. There's an increase in dead infrastructure like schools, colleges, offices, gyms, etc. There's an increased demand to spend time at open or semi-open spaces. And finally, there's an emergence of pop-up health centers through the city. The architectural uses of my thesis. The pandemic has brought a greater sense of appreciation for our homes. The expectation is that even after the quarantine period, more people will work from home. There is a possibility to rethink the dwellings of the future. There is also a possibility to intervene the infrastructure which is dysfunctional at the moment. These structures may be retrofitted to create hybrid spaces as per our changing needs. Thank you.
Thanks, Kritika. Can I now request Priyanka to make her presentation, please?
Yes, just a minute. I'm sharing my screen.
Yeah.
Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, I'm Priyanka, and I'll be presenting my dissertation titled Shaping Publicness, Recreational Grounds and Mumbai Suburban Settings. What is the idea of green in our city? While discussing my experiences in two different cities, I could feel a difference in how the recreational spaces in different regions shape their functions. In contradiction to the experience of another city where the public parks, green spaces were a part of the city, the idea of public parks and the same green spaces in our city is very different. The whole system of the greens being a conditional space is what made me reach to this question of how would the green spaces in our city be different if the current restrictions or barriers on them are lifted? How will this change the behavior of its usage? The objective was to map the relationship between physical and social settings and the publicness of public spaces, and therefore the research question was, how does the architecture of the green spaces shape its publicness? Jeff Hayward talks about parks being an asset. This asset has two aspects to it. First, being a social and behavioral aspect which enhances the image and the perceived value of the community. And the second is the physical aspect and the quality of the urban life, where the parks, playgrounds broaden the variety of leisure and recreational activities. He tries to build a relationship between social and physical environment by asking questions like what do people want, how has the community changed since the time the introduction of the park has happened in the neighborhood, and what is the public image of the park, and what attitudes do people have that affect the park use. Likewise, Jan Gill in his work segregates outdoor activities as a framework of three aspects, basically necessary activities, optional activities, and social activities. Depending on these concepts, the research is taken ahead. To understand the spatiality, social setting, and physical settings of these parks, gardens, and recreational spaces, I asked a set of questions like characteristics of the space or the layout, what are the activities that the space affords, and social setting through the typology of the neighborhood, the users and their kinds, and the patterns of the sites. A physical setting like scale of the site, the edge condition, and the landscape of the neighborhood also were a part of these categories. The swatches of these greenscapes are located in the area of the IC colony of the Link Road, starting from the uppermost extent in the Daisar and going towards the Exer Road. The sites are first the YMCA ground, second, which is a pet park, the third, green ground, which is essentially a garden, fourth is a fish park, which is named as the Tukhara Park, and fifth is the Mother Teresa Garden. Essentially, I segregated these swatches into namely recreational areas, gardens, and playgrounds, considering the kinds of functions they offered. All of them being on the neighborhood levels, their scales range from 2,000 square meters to 13,000 square meters. The Mother Teresa playground is located in the inner parts of the IC colony and shares a close boundary with the residential buildings on one side and a car wash on another side. There is a road. There is a road running across. I'm sorry. There's a road running along one side of the park, which has a residential building on which the ground floor consists of a few small mechanical shops and cycle repair shops. People from all age groups of the neighborhood use the space, but one can see a higher influx and majority in elderly people, and the park otherwise is usually unused since the lack of amenities it has. Sometimes the people who come around for the repairs on the cycle shops and the car washes use the park and the swings around the edges as a time to pass as the pastime. Meanwhile, they are having the deliveries made. The second is the fish park. the Tukhara Park is located along the link road and on the one side and stretches to the inner part of the IC on the other side. It has essentially two access points. It is one of the largest green space amongst the studied swatches, with the highest density of the greens and the variety of plants and trees. Due to this, walking the walking track, the jogging track, and the cycle track are usually covered in shade, which is the most used part of this whole space. It has two access points, one from the IC colony, which is the innermost intimate access point, and the other is from the link road, which is across the Ganpat Patil settlement. Because of differences in the kind of users that reside across the access points, it has two one can see a class difference, and it has made the space has made a mental barricade for people who come and use it, because there's one side where the crowd from the informal settlement uses the garden, whereas the other side is used by locals from the IC colony. So one can see a very much stark dialect between how the park is being used, even though it's one of the largest amongst the others. The next is the Green Garden, which is also located in the innermost parts of IC and is being surrounded by residential areas, residential apartments, and open lands on the either sides. It is one can see a lot of teenagers smiling around the garden, whereas the garden is usually compact and in use in the evening times, because that's when the residentials come out and have their jogging and walking tracks. In spite of the garden being open all the time, say one can see a very much stark difference between how the garden is used and how the road alongside is used, because the teenagers and sometimes even adult men are playing cricket on the road because the garden itself lacks a lot of space for such kind of activities. Okay. So these are, and also one edge of the park is connected to a pet park, which essentially activates most of the times during the dog shows or dog competitions. Otherwise, it's a very huge amount of softscape. So the findings of my studies were, first is the rigidity of the edges. These gardens and playgrounds in our locality are restricted and bound by either physical barriers or by time. The inner roads of the locality have a very low vehicular access and very low vehicular usage, and hence are occupied by a lot of people in the late evenings and along the day. So how can these green spaces mold to become flexible in terms of the usages and the functions they offer? Secondly, there is a difference in all their scales. The fish park, being the largest, has much lesser number of activities and amenities than than the YMCA ground, which has a very definite structure. Hence does the scale and infrastructure need to be definite? Thank you. I'm done. I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, Priyanka. Can I request Tarishi to start her presentation, please?
Yes, thanks, Komal. Is it visible?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Hello everyone, this is Tarishi. My thesis is called Environment Recast. It's a glossary of revised partialities during a pandemic. The purpose of this thesis is to look at the practices and ways that started coming up during the time of a health pandemic and its relationship with space. The pandemic leads to the generation of a new environment or a new normal in the everyday through the emerging practices. The title suggests the change in roles of a space and its users and audiences by exploiting its potentials through ways of transgression. It also makes us realize the various ways in which we inhabit space because of an amplified awareness and recreation of boundaries in the pandemic. Hence, the aim is to understand the role of transgressions in the making of space through practice. The broader concept that the research is based on are the idea of transgressions, boundaries, physical and metaphysical, transgression through practice, and the transgression of architecture and architecture of transgressions, wherein architecture of transgressions talks about the ways of mechanisms in which transgressions occur, while transgression of architecture talks about how do people go beyond the boundaries that have been crafted for them through architecture. And in this research, I focus on the latter. The research is conducted in two parts. The readings that form the conceptual and analytical framework. This is followed by a collection of emerging transgressive practices in the neighborhoods of Borivali. The second part tries to answer certain broader analytical questions like what is the relationship between organization of space and practices? How do societal frameworks change to absorb these practices? And what are the emerging spatialities of the pandemic? The collection of practices happened through a study of various thresholds, starting from the individual, then the shared boundaries, to the commons, and then the public. These practices are studied and reduced to working drawings. This is a collection of 20 instances, out of which 10 are being discussed in this presentation. So I'll start off with the threshold of the public boundary, of the personal boundary. Due to the COVID, the dynamics of personal boundaries have changed. It reframes how we extend ourselves to deal with this new normal. These practices vary with the different ideas of a house. This particular instance is observed in a chawl, where the necessity to physically separate oneself from others generates new practices of transgressions, hence new portals emerging, such as in balconies. In another instance, that of an apartment, the lobby becomes a no man's land between the apartments, and a veiled form of interaction and conversation emerges. In a more individualistic bubble, certain pre-existing practices are intensified to absorb the increasing personal engagements, thus leading to the need of a multi-utility apparatus. Next is the threshold of commons. This instance observes the emergence of different forms of escape within the immediate commons, away from the forced confinements of the home. Hence, the rickshaws become the individual pods for conversations and escape. The inability of the movement of the consumer has led to various utilities coming to our doorsteps. This means a change in the primary function of spaces like cars, vans, trucks, etc. In this case, a van becoming a food truck. The market practices have reduced to interactions only on the basis of visibility. The counter becomes a zone of countless transactions, making the role of the shopkeeper reduced to that of a cash collector. The spatiality of the shop is reduced to only that of the front. Hence, here, a shop becomes a vending machine. The need for fast, close-range healthcare and the deficit of its availability had led to a change in the idea of the clinic. It has taken up the form of a caravan moving from place to place as per the need. The various temporary demarcations and barriers creates a city of checkposts where space is encountered in a series of stages. This organizational nature of space has also brought about a change in the daily practices of worship and exchange. For instance, the temple working on an appointment basis. From these collected instances, by bringing them together, I try to understand how the city is emerging as. The new ways and practices show how we try to extend ourselves and transgress our boundaries to fit into the new normal. The city thus emerges as an extension of ourselves, helping us mobilize it every day through these transgressive practices. The various bubbles and checkposts that we have created seem like a series of safe houses in the city. The house with its multiple portals and the moving markets and other enterprises have rendered useful in optimizing the allocation of services and hence space. While the increasing checkposts and demarcations have also forced us into an order. From here, I would like to conclude asking the questions that the pandemic has pushed us to use everyday spaces almost at their edges, pushing the limits. Was there always this potential? If yes, then why wasn't it seen before? Where do we stand vis-a-vis the use of space? The pandemic has really pushed us to utilize and exist in the confinements of our space in new ways. What are the things that should be continued and the ones where we should fall back to? As an architect, how should we strive a balance between preserving these potentials and also making space? Thank you.
Thanks, Tarishi. Thank you for all your presentations and very sort of pertinent questions that come up from all your sort of researches. One, of course, from Kritika's work and Priyanka's work, this whole idea, and also something that we were discussing on the first couple of days. The idea of what is public and what is private. That sort of starts opening up about the home sort of expanding into the city, and the city sort of coming capsuling into the home in that sense, and the merging of these spheres, the public as well as the private. Through Priyanka's thesis also, there is the question of these new sort of collectives, and although there's no material physical space, there is sort of there are new collectives which are getting formed through the virtual space, and those kind of questions. And then through Tarishi's work, of the idea of the thresholds and transgressions, and the fact that we are, engaging with the edges of the city. What are these new sort of voids? Are we looking at newer voids that are getting formed? Are we looking at voids that need to be filled up in the way that we are going to use the city, in the times to come? So really, what does it mean, to use space at all these various scales? With those sort of questions, I open up to the discussants. Anybody who would like to go first? Vishwanath, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So I'll start with the third presentation first. Actually, the third and the first, Tarishi and Krutika, because they are focusing, they are putting the spotlight on the pandemic itself. So Tarishi, I saw some interesting observations that you made, and I wish that you could really research that a bit further. I'll just pick up 3 points. Uh, One is you showed this interesting photograph of a person talking to their neighbor through their front door, right, through the jali of the door, and so I was immediately thinking of what is the lobby design like. So one of the standard lobby configurations, of course, is two doors which are facing each other and a staircase at right angles to it. Another standard lobby configuration is four doors in a lobby, two which are facing each other, but two of them face the staircase. This typically happens in a when you have smaller apartments. And what you're indicating here is fascinating, that I imagine if the apartment, the lobby type was one with four doors, then the people who are facing each other still are able to communicate standing inside their house. But the two people who are living facing the staircase are not able to do so. Yeah. I think the same would hold true for the other interesting example that you showed of someone lowering a basket using a rope, or like you said, a wire. Uh, Again, there I'm reminded of. You said that example of was one of a chawl. Uh, I myself stay in a walk-up apartment, which is only G+2. And I remember that till at least 10-15 years back, we used to do the same thing, that from the we have a small front lobby kind of thing in our apartment. So we would stand on the window and lower this, especially to buy vegetables on a day-to-day basis. But what is interesting is that the moment you have four apartments to a floor, two people's balcony face the back and two people's balcony would face the street. So suddenly the pandemic would start affecting the four houses very differently. right? The third is the shop. What you said as the shop as the vending machine. There, I think what would be interesting to explore is what happens to the proportion of the shop. I mean, the traditional way of looking at commercial projects is less frontage and more depth. This is to maximize the profit that you gain from the frontage. Whereas interestingly, when we look at the vending machine works on a very different logic, that it is wider than it is deeper. And now suddenly, if you're saying that because of the pandemic, shops need to be wider and less deeper, it takes us into a different kind of interrogation. So uh, uh, similarly, I think in Kritika's case also, especially when you are talking of those public spaces and how people are occupying the public spaces, uh, and you showed some photographs of how people are maintaining social distance. But especially in a place like Mumbai, where public space is always associated with extreme densities, it would be very interesting to ask the question, how does one perceive public space in the city, especially in this kind of scenario? So I felt that, in fact, I felt that of all the three studies in this panel, that I felt that you have taken the first step of observing your environments carefully, but I do think that you have still not articulated what is the lens through which you want to analyze this. So my sense is right now it is at the stage of a report. You are reporting a situation. I think you need to apply some framework, some lens in order to analyze the situation. Uh, Coming to Priyanka's thesis, where you're looking at different types of open spaces, uh, I'm wondering whether, especially, I mean, when you're analyzing and when you're concluding, what is it that you want to, uh, are you trying to say that there is a difference in the nature of the public space based on what is the perceived function of the public space? Or is it that you want to correlate it with the position or location in the city where it is located? Or is it that you want to correlate it with uh, the type of public space, where you are saying that the park and the dog park versus the YMCA ground are being used differently because uh, uh, they have been named differently. So I was not quite clear about what is it that you wanted to conclude out of it. So maybe you could throw some light on it. Yeah.
All right. Kush, would you like to go next?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Komal. Kritika, Priyanka, Tharishi, thank you. Thanks for your individual presentations, which are trying to center the moment that we find ourselves in, the pandemic. But to be honest, I think one of the things that really cuts across all three projects is the urgency, the relevance of the questions. I couldn't locate it. I couldn't find it. Why is this relevant? And I'll be more specific. It almost seems as if there's a very distant engagement with a pandemic, enough to then say, how can we utilize the pandemic as an opportunity to rethink whether it's architectural typologies or questions of publicness, or even ways in which different socialities are being produced. And the very sort of, these projects are cute. I'm sorry to say this, but they're cute in the sense that they're deeply sanitized accounts of the pandemic with no sense of what is at stake, either for the individual or groups of people or families who are trying to make sense of their day-to-day life, living with enough grief living with questions of well-being, living with questions of longing, living with questions of anxiety. None of those intersections with space came through in your presentations. And I'm looking at it as a kind of a group, as a cluster. So when Tarishi, when you talk about what is the glossary of spatialities around transgressions that one can begin to produce enough to invoke a rethinking of architectural assumptions, the very idea of what are you transgressing doesn't get addressed. Transgressions are not just transgressions because we've been met with a certain kind of an obstacle in the now, but the transgressions that you're talking about and transgressions that happen are often careful navigations through our day-to-day lives, either based on our individual subject positions, the kinds of contexts we find ourselves in, or even in this case, the pandemic. So I think, what are people transgressing and what are the limits of those transgressions is not coming through in your project. So, I was, like Vishwanath, I was fascinated by that Jali door as well, and the ways in which the Jali door is affording a certain kind of engagement. But then I think there's also an opportunity to say how some of these screens that define our environments are also reducing the environment to a series of insularities or insular spaces. So instead of providing new affordances to engage, a critique could be that it's not dismantling the class hierarchies. It's not dismantling or transgressing gendered boundaries. On the contrary, it's reinforcing them and providing new layers of architectural controls, or using common architectural devices like the door or the balcony to in fact relegate you to where you are. So it turns out to be a much more conservative finding than an actual liberatory one, because it is not intersecting with questions of well-being, grief, longing, anxiety. And these are just some of the markers that I've highlighted in the context of the pandemic. And likewise for Kritika, yes, rethinking, spatial changes or asking this question of what are the spatial changes resulting from the pandemic and new practices, ultimately you conclude with multiple uses of space, annexures, dead infrastructure, ways in which there is a need for more openness, and pop-up health centers. And I'm wondering what is so new about that finding, given the kind of densities that we live in. These are kind of our everyday longings, regardless of whether or not we find ourselves in a pandemic. So what is that urgency that the pandemic draws your attention to? And what are the actual challenges of pandemic as it affects different populations? I think that idea, it's a very singular class question here, and the ways in which different populations are struggling to make sense of their day-to-day lives in a pandemic is not coming through. And so I was thinking that here's an opportunity to then ask, instead of saying a pop-up health center is needed, the question then becomes, what are the micro infrastructures of community protection that one can begin to center one's research around and think about and design kind of an approach towards? And the focus on micro infrastructure again returns you to a scale which is understood at the level of research, but also community protection or neighborhood protection or population protection allows you to then identify what are we protecting ourselves against or from. And so the sense of location of the pandemic in the context of Bombay and the places that you study would become relevant and much more materially believable. And Priyanka, this project of shaping publicness with regards to greenness, I wish your drawings had a much more granular sort of understanding of, but how are these green spaces not just locationally different, but also typologically unique or similar. And I was waiting to sort of get it much more, so thanks for providing much more zoomed out sections so one starts seeing those green spaces in relation to the urbanities around. But then what is the very landscape? What is the very character of these spaces? that is lending itself to notions of publicness, or challenging conventions of public gathering, or creating a new public by virtue of them being spaces for activities that are quote unquote visible or illegal, or anything and everything in between. So I think I was looking for a much more granular appreciation of greenness as a way to then unpack what is this idea of green, what are the spectrums, or what is the larger continuum of green that becomes that corresponds with the continuum along which we find ourselves being public or not in a city. So I'll just pause there and hope to return to it in a larger discussion.
Sure. Prasad, can I request you to make your comments before I go back to the panel?
Sure. I mean, there's something interesting about the three presentations, in the sense of that if anything that it shows is, one is that something that we haven't really spoken about in the last 3 days is how much of health regulations is actually such an important part of architecture, right? Like I remember reading this book on architecture in Bombay after the plague, where they actually were talking about the thickness of the walls being designed in a way that rats can't chew their way through the walls, right? And so the thickness of the walls, that's, like you said, the size of the windows, the organization of the space. I mean, under colonial planning, it has very much been a part of, Bombay planning. A lot of the planning regulations do come out of health reports, right, under the British. Also, the Central Park in New York is kind of an interesting, because although it is a health related intervention, right, but it's become something else, right? So the way in which I was thinking about these projects is, what is the afterlife of these forms, right, that have emerged during the pandemic, right? Now, in Kritika's case, a lot of the, a certain kinds of typologies have, popped up, like a temporary hospital is something of a particular sort of, I mean, it probably had before, but it is a specific type that came up during the pandemic. And I saw it even in Guwahati, where I was, the stadium getting converted into a hospital, and it's sort of dissolving, guest houses becoming hospitals. A lot of the regular built forms had started to become containment zones, and also quarantine zones, right? Now, the quarantine has become an important aspect of architecture, in the sense of that we're thinking about these buffer zones as quarantine zones. And the time of the quarantine is changes, right? The house can become a quarantine for a longer period of time, while the balconies and the roads and the courtyards can become shorter quarantine zones, right? So the question is more of yes, the fruit trucks have come up. The house has sort of transformed into a sort of a safe, secure bubble. Balconies have become places for social transactions and social relationships across people, and at different scales, there's these different shifts that are occurring, and which is what your study was in the first case that was kind of showing, right? You sort of traced how different health conditions have changed architecture in many ways, right? And so the interesting thing would be to actually see and for you to sort of push and take a step ahead is what are these, conceptual shifts in terms of space that you start seeing, right? For example, the idea of the open space as a space, as the lung of the city, right? It's a conceptual thing that comes up with, thinking about city planning through the lens of health, right? So in those cases, at this right now, you're looking at the micro possibilities that have come up, right? But if you have to push it and think about it in terms of what is going to be the afterlife, or what is going to be the life of these spatial changes that are going to be, so what would that be? Right? It might be in terms of certain kinds of typologies becoming more, coming up and sort of going down, because people are now going to start thinking about zootic viruses going to be a permanent condition, right? So is there a possibility to start thinking about certain kinds of, or in the conditions where zones become containment zones and quarantine zones, then what is the possibility of different kinds of architectural possibilities that opened up? So not all of them have to become possibilities, but science to think about, is there other ways of thinking about future conditions for architecture, right? How do we think about social relationships between houses if we are now starting to think about architecture? Because health planning throughout colonial planning has always been like one violent process, and that is what most of the books write about. That the body was violated. There's the kind of rules that were enforced. So is there other forms of architectural possibilities that are possible, thinking that we have to take the condition of the virus more seriously, right? What kind of possibilities have opened up? How do we start rethinking architecture, be it at the scale of housing, be it at the scale of city, at the scale of shops, which is what your different scales are? How do we think about it while thinking that it does not have to be that kind of violence of the health plan, right? Priyanka, again, I mean, like the other two, like Vishwanath and Kush said, it is about you're looking at different scales of open spaces and the different kinds of activities. What is the different characteristics, also the different kinds of edge conditions that it allows for. And I was thinking about it more in the sense of, given the topic of the panel, to think about the pandemic. What happens to these ideas of publicness and public spaces when the lung of the city starts to get contaminated, right? Or starts to shut down, right? When the lung itself starts sort of shutting down, which is what happens, that the parks were shut for the longest period of time, because they were thought of as places of, what happens in those kinds of, what happens to those activities in architectural terms if the public parks is going to not, it's going to be shut down in these kind of moments. So is there other kinds of, possibilities for the future that opened up when the lungs started, the breathing space starts, so where do people actually go to breathe? In a lot of ways, I felt like and this is from Guwahati, that the roads actually became quite different, had a very different character, although there was lines and everything, that become very pedestrian and a constant sense of movement. No one was stopping. There was a different character. So what happens to the sense of publicness in a time of pandemic? It's not as if it disappears, but it takes on a different kind of form, right? And does that allow us to, again, go back to thinking about open space then differently, right? Or the idea of, what the lung of the city is in a very different sort of way. In the last presentation, it was in some sense a very scary presentation also, because you kind of feel the infrastructure of security and fear is always there. And it's now starting to get activated given the fact that the pandemic is here and you have to start, the lobby screen was always there, right? But for a different sense of fear and security. But now it's sort of taking on a different meaning. And it's not as if the lobby door is going to actually avoid the air from coming in or out. But it's still, you sort of start thinking about these. But again, they were interesting. But each of the spaces you actually talk about have very different characteristics, right? The lobby space is a very different space than a temple. Right, the lobby space in some ways is always for a sense of, sort of a buffering and screening, right? A temple is not that kind of space, right? So you might want to distinguish the details of these different kinds of spaces, right? That the second thing that I found was also that, when you start talking about the shopkeeper becoming a vending machine, right? I felt that there was, in some sense, a certain certain abstraction, reducing of the shop to a vending machine, right? It's not as if the human is not there, right? It's not as if it disappears, it takes on a different role, or it becomes a part of the machine in a very different sort of way, right? So what is that relationship between the machine and the human, or that comes up in a shop, right? What happens to the characteristics of the temple beyond just appointments, right? Like, it has a spatial characteristics that comes up, right? So that each of them are very different kinds of spaces, which you say that, that you're looking at different types of spaces and whatever. So, but to sort of, give it, so in some sense also detail out what those different relationships these shops and these temples and things have, is something I felt that, will open up a lot more. An important point is that we don't really, and that's something even I've felt, and also that, we've not really thought how much about the, the health policies and regulations have been defining architecture, right? And it's sort of become a moment to think about that. And there is also a sense that, the health architecture has always also been taken over by capital and money and real estate in many ways, right? So it's also to think about what is going to happen with these forms now, right? Because if you want to start thinking about the vaccine, and that it might be a temporary condition, but might keep coming over a period of time in very different forms. How do you want to think about the afterlife of these forms, right? Also, there was a sense of, which I think Kush pointed out, that each of these spaces have a very different kinds of, social class relationship. Temple is very different from a lobby space. But there are also spaces that can't be transgressed, right? That the pandemic also sort of pointed out that there were certain spaces that couldn't be transgressed, right? Or didn't have that possibility of transgression, right? What are those kind of spaces also, right? So these are just thoughts. I mean, the interesting provocations to think about, what is going to be an afterlife of architecture and planning and urban form. And can you think about architecture, urban form that doesn't become so violent, right? Do we have to then start thinking about, like places for, migrants, you have to start thinking. So what kind of possibilities open up? Because a lot of people did shift a lot, the essential services came up and people sort of quickly changed shops, right? And, I've seen markets actually pop up in the pandemic also, which never existed before. So there are these shifts that have occurred, and they are going to have an afterlife. So how do you think about the afterlife, given what is going on right now? Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, all three of you, for your comments, questions, and provocations. Would you all like to respond? Tarishi, would you like to go first?
Yeah. So I kind of want to talk about the lens from which I'm looking. So the lens from which I was looking was the transgression of architecture, and though I kind of focused on the spatialities that were kind of being transgressed, I didn't want to deny the fact that that I mean, the other metaphysical boundaries didn't exist or people aren't transgressing it, but I kind of wanted to keep more of a focus on the spatialities of it. But I mean, I would like to say that most of the examples, they do have a trigger. For instance, people looking out for an escape in autos, and also when we look at the social background of this area, and I mean, we look at how this idea of anxiety being in the confinements of their houses and all, it kind of pushes them to look for an escape. And so how somebody who's living in a chawl kind of tries to find a space of escape in these autos which are redundant right now, which aren't being used, they are being parked and all of that. So there's this trigger which is kind of making them transgress the spatialities. And then so the woman who's kind of making the boundary, making the balcony as a portal, I mean, it isn't that, I mean, she can't go down fetch vegetables and all, but there's in a chawl, I mean, so the chawl which I kind of showed as an example, I am staying in it, and I can see in these in the everyday that how, I mean, the women are kind of still confined in the houses, and the men kind of are the the members of the family who kind of go out to buy supplies and all of that. So in such a scenario, how does the woman kind of tries to break, and if she's not able to break the the boundaries of the social, then how does she try to maybe break a physical boundary, and then maybe and through all of these triggers, the new spatialities which are emerging are kind of the ones which I feel that as an architect we should look at. And I mean, while they are being definitely used during this time of a pandemic, how they just like, I mean, Vishwanath talked about how it leads to us identifying these new spatialities, new organizations, which would definitely help with living in the density of the city. So I mean, yeah, I did kind of focus more on the spatialities, but yeah, and yeah, I mean, that would be all.
Thanks, Harishi. Kritika, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I just want to just say that thinking about what will be the architecture of the future and what will be the afterlife of the forms. So I was just there were some minor observations which I did not include in the presentation. So like in the apartment level also, there are like so many changes. Like the watchman's cabin was filled with parcels from people because vendors and courier postmen weren't allowed to enter societies. So like right now, today my internet was not working, so I had to come to my friend's house for the presentation. And like today, so while coming, the place where people sit, the benches outside were filled with these tiffin boxes and courier parcels and all of that. And in the city level also, there is a change in the idea of crime. So like without mask you will be fined, or more than 4 people not allowed in the car, or the night curfew. So these are minor changes at the city level. And I'm sure like how the Bombay plague had different bylaws at various levels, this pandemic can also have all these change. The impact can be a change in the architectural standards of how we build our houses, neighborhoods and cities. And like just how you said that many more viruses are coming up. So right now, when scientists have discovered a vaccine, there's another mutant form of the virus, and there is a new strain of it. So yeah, we will continue. We will have to update how we think about our houses. Yeah.
Priyanka, do you want to perhaps talk?
Yeah. So coming to Vishwanath's question about how I'm trying to differentiate between these greenscapes, if you say, so what I was initially trying to do was, and that's what my understanding was, that these kind of spaces are going to differentiate, are going to get segregated in terms of their form and their function, basically their functions, because what the kind of sites I have. So when you asked me, when you said that does the function differ from what it is named, if it's a pet park or per se if it's another some ground, um, no, I think in my case at least, what happens is, what I considered was what is happening right now over there in terms of what kind of amenities these places are providing. So when I say that this pet park is not used much, but the YMCA ground is used uh, more than it, it's more because the YMCA ground has a designated basketball court, it has a designated badminton court, and perhaps that's the reason there are different kinds of activities and happens in those, and they function in a way. So there were differentiations made by what kind of functions or use they are offering towards me, and not so. So one more thing, like not according to how they're named. So all of these are named as gardens, and the first thing which came to my mind was, it's a garden is very different than what probably a recreational area is. So the nomenclatures were very different than what the differentiations were made. And also coming to a point where when you say what might happen, what will happen to the architecture when the lungs of the city are perhaps collapsing or shutting down. So when I was visiting these places during the lockdown, when so in that period when the parks were shut and just about to, and then a later period when they're just about to open or opened a week ago or something, I the one thing I noticed more was throughout the day, even though it's sunny on the road or however the conditions on the road is, the parks, any kind of a park over there in the whole colony, in fact, are very much less occupied or perhaps never occupied than how the roads are. So the activities, either play or having, consuming alcohol, playing, smoking, be it any kind of activities, all of those are happening on the road. So this question of why are the lungs in our city these swatches and not something which connect. So I'm trying to reframe it in a proper way, but basically, why are they bound by things? Why? So is there no COVID on the road, and is there something inside the park that if it's open that they are not using it, but if they're using the road, what is the reason? So maybe because all of our greenscapes are bounded by physical barriers or probably time differences or something like that. And then there is an issue and there's a topic of whether these places are guarded or not. So there are a couple of places which are not guarded at all, and hence they're occupied by a class wherein other people wouldn't be comfortable going to that place. So the thought of having these lungs as pockets is something which I was also thinking of, but I'm still coming to that point. So I don't know how much I have answered, but yeah.
I also particularly found the provocation that I think Kashika raised for Tarishi from Tarishi's presentation, where he sort of spoke about these different configurations of the houses, with regard to the lift and the orientation of the balcony and how that sort of what the different houses afford different kind of escapes to those inhabitants and Tarishi, if you want to respond to that, or anyone else sort of wants to pick up from that point.
mean, yeah, it is these organizations only which kind of during the pandemic we kind of then started to look at now how somebody would maybe socialize, or what would it be for a person who has a balcony on the back of the apartments and all of that. But yeah, so I feel I mean, looking at all of these instances, it kind of definitely raises the question. And I mean, the way I'm asking that, maybe this certain space is acting like this, maybe a door is not a door anymore but more like a jali for a conversation. But then it definitely also raises the question that if not this, then what it can be, and what are these new requirements or additions which need to be there, these new spatialities. Do we, maybe the apartments should, is there a need of series of screens, or series of balconies, and how should then these organizations be? So I mean, yes, it definitely questions the afterlife of these spatialities which kind of emerged during the pandemic. And then it kind of questions that maybe it would help ahead. I mean, even if it isn't a scenario of the pandemic, then it might help with the density of the city, and yeah, all of that.
Thanks. Any other sort of comments, questions from the faculty or from the class?
So that I mean, this is an interesting panel actually. One is, on one side there is a whole idea of the pandemic and the pandemic kind of having impact on the outside space really, and of course the inside space also, but largely about the outside space and the various kinds of transactions that kind of take place. And then in that context also Priyanka kind of posing her issues with respect to the use and the spread of open spaces at the neighborhood level. I was just thinking in terms of like the architectural questions that may emerge. I mean one is of course uh, the health and sanitation and these kind of coordinates shaping the built form and space, etc. This is something uh, which one has seen before in other pandemics also. But how do you kind of we've been thinking at school, and the difficulty of it is to talk about it at this moment from being within it, in the absence of data, and kind of in the absence of how do you collect data, and what are we've been entering it through practices, and we've initiated all kinds of discussions. But what are the ways in which one kind of responds to the pandemic, uh, you know uh, in terms of particularly when the pandemic actually kind of also in many ways um, it accelerates so many things that are already uh, kind of which are already in place or happening. For example, the uh, the 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 irrelevance of proximity for commerce and finance. This is something which had already started happening, but now the pandemic kind of forces you to kind of get that uh, you know make it very explicit and very alive for everybody in everybody's life. Or the digital, it is not that we kind of invented a space shuttle after the pandemic. It is something which we continued, which we knew already, which we continued and pushed forward, which we kind of continued and pushed forward. So some things which were already kind of consolidating, and that kind of gets pushed into, and those kind of questions those kind of architectural questions where certain logistical there are certain logistical advantages or logistical efficiencies that that the pandemic has kind of put in place for life. For example, the shops and the absence of shops, the hike in online transactions, and so many other things. There are so many logistical things that many offices, institutions, corporations have kind of are already thinking of adopting to, and kind of using, and kind of making kind of living with it, because because they're efficient. They're kind of so 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 what kind, I'm just thinking in terms of and then what happens to the open space that Priyanka kind of speaks about, because that open space it like our open spaces over here have been there have been limited kind of, and people have kind of moved into all kinds of spaces also. And the outside space and the transactional spaces which became institutions, public spaces, offices, commerce spaces, and all of those spaces, they are all appearing to be at least getting under interrogation. There is an interrogation of them. So is that the kind of move towards is that the emerging architectural kind of question? Is that do you all think that it's worthwhile to pursue that direction, to kind of make speculations on future living and life and possibilities, and explore how do you want to kind of engage with that situation where proximities are kind of really under threat, and newer kind of logistical efficiency are kind of taking over. So that is one part of it, in a very empirical sense, kind of going about the pandemic. The other is something which Kush kind of points out very sharply: the experiential, what happens to life in its visceral form. What happens to the everyday, the crisis and the families and the mental, the psychological situations, the small house context, the loss of a family member, the loss of livelihoods, and all of that also kind of I don't know what are the spatial questions in them, and I think that is something which Kush is kind of also pointing at, when he says it's cute, it's kind of it appeared, you look at it very superficially. All three of you in many ways actually look at that very superficially, looked at practices, and probably that is also because of your data, because all of you all also lived through difficult lives in this pandemic. I mean, one has not gone home for last 1 year almost. The other is kind of had several crises. So what he's pointing out is where did all of that go when you all were talking about the pandemic, and when you all were talking about the spatiality of the pandemic? Why did that not emerge in your works actually? And why did you all kind of distance yourselves so much? So two things to think about. Whether architects, a lot of architects are talking about logistical efficiencies and pursuing that direction. That is something which is very empirically feasible and quickly done, and people find markets for that. But there's an experiential question, and the spatiality of that experience of that pandemic. what is that? And is there any way to grasp it? Did you all think about it in terms of when, Kutika in your house or Priyanka in your kind of, neighborhood surveys, so many times restricted from going out, from kind of, getting into, moving houses because you are moving houses. Tarishi not being able to kind of, just trapped within that building actually. So you all want to kind of, figure out a way to talk about those experiences and through them the spatialities that the pandemic kind of the spatiality of the pandemic, and what does it mean for architects to kind of rethink strategies or even to kind of think about space.
Right. Thanks, Prasad.
Yeah.
Are there
Others
any...
can also come in.
Sorry?
I'm saying others can also come in because we've been kind of,
Kalpita has something.
Kalpita has a question.
Yeah.
She's saying when Vishwanath said that the pandemic affects differently according to the location or position of certain elements in the house, does a layer of media neutralize this effect?
Did it for you, Kalpita? Did that do it for you?
I mean, like according to me, I sometimes think that it does. I mean, I'm just comparing both the, like, I don't know what it was before 20 years, but then I'm just thinking of the times when it would have been happening like before 20 years. Then that would have been according to the position of your house, like how Vishwanath is talking about. But right now in this situation, I sometimes think that the layered media or the way we perceive things, it kinds of neutralize the effect of however it's like. I'm just asking the question.
Neutralize is probably the wrong word. It kind of it kind of engaged with it and probably created newer possibilities. Neutralize is something which I will not use to kind of describe the digital engagement with the entrapment that has been created by the pandemic.
Yeah,
It doesn't neutralize. Like, how do you kind of neutralize your inability to go out? No, how do you neutralize that? Like your senses are kind of are kind of put into an ironclad kind of prison. Nah?
yeah.
So neutralizing नहीं होगा पर एक engagement होगा, है ना?
Just to get back to, thanks for opening up the discussion along these two trajectories as well. And it's true. I mean, I think if you ask me, I think yes, there are architects and there are architects, and I think any attempt which rushes to find a solution to the pandemic is misplaced, in my opinion. I think we are too quick to even think of a solutionist approach to the pandemic, and that's happening. I mean, that's happening around us, and it often results in solutions that are shallow, that are about efficiency, that are about, again, a response to a certain class and group of people and their needs and digitality or what have you. But I think for me, the bigger question of the pandemic, and something that I grapple with as well, is how it has made visible a complete breakdown of infrastructure.
Yeah.
Health infrastructure in this country, public health infrastructure in this country, housing infrastructure in this country. And so I think if the architectural questions could be located at the scale of infrastructure, and infrastructure not in its largeness, but in its real tangibility, then that's where we begin to sort of then say, okay, what does it mean for densities to still live where they are, for the densities to still continue to be where they are, but then also what are the ways in which the question of protection assumes a material form, I think Kritika, concluded with this idea of a pop-up health center. But then, how can a pop-up health center not just be a tactical intervention, but a kind of a much more conscious effort to sort of say how within the sort of the vestiges of whether it's an extremely crowded neighborhood or a slum or even a high-end residential area, what are those crevices and cracks within which certain kinds of quarantining facilities or provisions or possibilities could emerge? And that's where the spatial and the social come together, I feel. And I think we still, because we are surrounded by the pandemic, we are amidst it, and it's just intensifying as we speak. I think close observation is what we can continue to do, but also not lose sight of the failures that are apparent, or the pandemic has made apparent to all of us. The failures of life around us, the failures of infrastructure that many architects have themselves built. And I think that's where the urgency is for me.
I mean, failures of institutions, the modern, the crisis, the health system, the governance systems, and so many other, the units which make the modern life, family, community, public space, government, all of that, you saw the crumbling happening because of the stupid virus, it's kind of, that happened actually. All of us felt it, and we spoke about it. Actually, we spoke about it at length in many occasions when we discussed the pandemic.
I want to respond to Vishwanath's comment. So just how you've written, there should be multiple entrances separate for servants, back entry, etc. So this has already started happening. So in the place, in the tower I'm currently in, so there are 3 elevators, okay? And they have one separate elevator for all these maids, servants and milkmen, etc. So, and even the regular elevator, which had a capacity of 15 people, has been restricted to 4 or 5 people, not more than that can access the elevator. So yeah, that is also one change that I have observed. So it's already started happening.
Sure. Rohit, do you want to quickly make your comment?
Yeah. Nice to see all the practices that you all put forth in the glossary. And as you all spoke about those practices, one of the things that came to my mind in terms of, the narrative emerges as a complete break from what was happening before. And what I was unable to catch was, were there any instances or any practices that drew on forms or practices of life before the pandemic, and how did they come into the pandemic? And this has got to do with the question of infrastructure now, and how we kind of even think about infrastructure. Say, for instance, the ward that I live in, where our school is in Borivali, had the highest doubling rate. 55 days was the doubling rate here, and the lowest one was around 100 or 120. This was sometime in May. And I have doctor friends with whom I was talking to often during the pandemic. And one started realizing in this ward that the cases are coming from all housing cooperative societies, but not from the slums, the so-called slums. What kind of infrastructure emerged in that place to to lessen the number of cases? And one of these doctors whom I was in conversation with told me that the people, the closest, the informal settlement which is closest to my house, which becomes a place from where people are rounded up by police, usually at nights. These were the same people, locally called as dadas. These were the same people who were given identity passes, not recorded, but identity passes as health workers, to check who comes in and who goes out. And this was a practice that was kind of being followed. So I mean, it's the way in which certain kinds of people, certain kinds of relationships that may be set up in the pandemic, that may be set up earlier, might be transforming, and what are the infrastructures that come into play to address this seems um, uh, I mean, I'm trying to draw attention to. I mean, are there any kind of continuities which transformed in some ways? And that sense I didn't get, which is what I wanted to connect to the question of infrastructure.
Yeah. Prasad, you have a point to make.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in some sense, you know, the logistical question is not very, you know, detached from the experiential question anymore. I mean, one of the things that happened and which you see around is that, you know, a sense of sort of you know, looking at strangers as contaminated bodies has, you know, emerged in some ways. You know, there's always a fear and suspicion of someone who's sort of approaching, right? And the other dominant sort of logic and discourse that one started seeing is, you know, this idea of, and which is something that is there in the medical discourse a lot, is this idea of the war, right? You're fighting the virus, right? You know, there are health warriors, they're not care workers, right? That, you know, there's a war on the pandemic. It's not a, you know, and so if one is to start thinking about, you know, ideas of care, right? You know, what is care of the self, also of others and your neighbors, and start looking like, you know, what is the infrastructure for care, right? And I mean care not in the sense necessarily of health, right? But care in the sense of, you know, also social relationships, you know, taking care of people who don't necessarily have those kind of quarantine boundaries, right? So if there's a shift to thinking not about, you know, the quarantine zones and buffer zones, but there's a possibility of starting to evolve a certain architecture of care, which has in some ways emerged, right, during this, both in terms of, you know, social relationships that also emerged, because a lot of people were going out and, you know, distributing food. There was a lot of money being circulated outside of government systems. People were setting up all kinds of things, right? It's not that, but there was also an architecture of cares that sort of emerged during this time, right? Based on what was there before, which also probably opens up a possibility of, you know, shifting the discourse on the pandemic, not as, you know, how do you fight it, right? But how do you sort of live with it with care, right? So if there's a shift towards, you know, thinking about it in a different way, it's something that is possible.
Sure. Thank you for all your comments. Vishwanath, do you want to speak about your point?
No, I'm fine. Just making a side note. Because I find that dimension also fascinating as to how we look at the survival of the species.
Right. All right. So I think we've already sort of over time. So I will close this by thanking all the discussants, all the panelists for your presentations. Thank you for adding on to the thinking around how to sort of think through this situation and how to think through pandemic spatialities. We will meet back for the last session for the symposium at 4:30. We'll see you all at 4:30. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Komal. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks.